I am Francesca Grandi. I'm a senior fellow at the Conflict Security and Development Program here at the Institute, and also the editor of the Armed Conflict Survey. It is my pleasure today to welcome you to the third installment of the IISS Conflict Briefing series. We started this monthly series because, as you know, the IISS produces a wealth of content and analysis on conflict-related issues, and we wanted to have the opportunity to share that knowledge with you. We also would like to hear your views and your feedback on how our sharing of our data and our analysis can help your work. So we always welcome your feedback and your views on how we can improve that. So please don't hesitate to tell us what you think afterwards. Every month we zoom in on a specific conflict, and today we're going to talk about the Philippines. And we have here Tim Huxley and Michael Hart, our in-house experts, who are going to help us make sense of the conflict in the Philippines, as well as its implications for regional and global geopolitical issues. Michael is a writer and researcher covering armed conflict, terrorism, and politics in Southeast Asia. He has a long experience studying the violence in the Philippines, which he covers in his role as an analyst for the Armed Conflict Database, our online repository of conflict-related data. Michael writes also for a number of publications, including World Politics Review, The Diplomat, Asia Sentinel, Geopolitical Monitor, Asia Correspondent, Eurasia Review, and the Japan Times. He has a master's in international relations from the University of Westminster. For those of you familiar with the work of IISS, of course, Tim needs no introduction, but for the benefit of the others, I will tell you that Tim plays a leading role in organizing the IISS annual Shangri-La Dialogue, our flagship intergovernmental security forum in the Asia Pacific. Tim leads also the Fullerton Forum and lecture series, and all IISS research on the Asia Pacific. He edits the annual publication Asia Pacific Regional Securities Assessment and contributes extensively to many other publications of IISS, as well as advising work. He is an expert in Southeast Asia and the Pacific region, with a focus on defense policy, military capability, alliances, and security cooperation. He has a long experience in studying and assessing security and defense policies in Southeast Asia and the security roles of major powers in the Asia-Pacific region. As usual, our session today will take the form of a conversation with no formal presentations. I will ask questions to our in-house experts to tease out the key developments of the conflict in the Philippines, and also and I will also ask them to help us make sense of the regional geopolitics implication. After our conversation, you will of course have time to ask questions. And while we talk, in the background, we will showcase some work from the Armed Conflict Database in the forms of data and visualization of maps of different kinds. So without further ado, I will start with my questions to Michael. Could you give us a sense of the state of the conflict? So it has been 18 months since the start of the Marawi siege, a 5-month battle between the Filipino government forces and ISIL affiliated groups, as well as the more established Abu Sayyaf group. What has happened since?
Yeah, thanks, Francesca. So just for 30 seconds to start with, just to recap what actually happened in Marawi last year. Because most of the discussion today is really framed in the context of what happened. It was a very, very significant event in the conflict, really the most significant event to have occurred in several decades. So in May 2017, the Philippine military launched an operation in Marawi with the aim of capturing Isnil Hapilon, who was the leader of the Abu Sayyaf group at the time. They were acting on intelligence reports that he was in the city with a small number of Abu Sayyaf fighters. However, they were vastly outmatched by the strength of the militants. It took them by huge surprise. It turned out that there were almost 1,000 militants in the city from the Abu Sayyaf group, the Maute group, and smaller numbers from the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters and Ansar Khalifa Philippines. So what initially was just a raid to capture a militant leader turned into a 5-month conflict typified by urban warfare, snipers on the militant side, mass displacement, more than 300,000 people displaced, hundreds of civilian hostages taken, and running battles on the streets, which lasted until October 2017, when the militants were finally defeated. The leaders of the Maute group were killed, and Isnil and Hapilon, the original target of the raid, also died in the final days of the siege. And it was quite an unprecedented event in the fact that these militant groups actually came together to act in the name of the Islamic State to attempt to actually take and seize territory in Marawi city. And it's something that we hadn't really seen before in this region, and it marked a huge transition in the conflict and a key moment of the conflict, which for most of its 5 decades had really been a separatist insurgency, with local grievances being at the forefront, to all of a sudden this being seen through the lens of transnational jihadism, with Islamic State really claiming responsibility for the attack. So really what's happened since, going back to the original question, the fortunes of the ISIS-linked groups involved have been quite mixed in the years since. The Maute group, which was the main protagonist really in the siege, was almost completely obliterated during the 5-month conflict. Whereas it had almost 1,000 members before, it had less than 50 members by the time the siege came to an end in October last year. And in the time since, those Maute group fighters have been laying low in Lanao del Sur province, and a rumoured presence in Lanao del Norte province as well. They've been, according to the Philippine military, they've been attempting to recruit from impoverished communities in the area to try and bolster their ranks. But in terms of 2018 is concerned, they've only clashed with the military on a very small number of occasions, in clashes which have often resulted in, just a couple of fatalities. So the Maute group have gone from the most significant ISIS-linked group to being really one of the least significant today. However, there is still the potential that they could recruit new fighters and look to bolster their ranks again. So I think we can see on the map here, if I just shift slightly, the Maute group are marked in the purple at the top left of the map. And Marawi is in Lanao del Sur province on the shores of Lake Lanao there. So really the Maute group are present there, but they're estimated to still have less than 100 fighters, even given the recruitment activities that have been ongoing. So slightly further south, in the sort of light orange color, is the provinces where the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters operate. And that group really has now become the main group that is taking forward the ambitions of the Islamic State in the southern Philippines. And they have around 300 to 500 fighters. It's also thought that members of the Maute group who fled Marawi in the final weeks of the siege, and foreign fighters from Indonesia and Malaysia who had come across to the southern Philippines, once the Maute group disintegrated and the Marawi siege came to an end, they then went on to join the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters. And this year, they've engaged in quite large-scale clashes with the military. The armed forces have launched quite significant offensives targeting them, making use of both ground troops and also airstrikes. So that's where violence has really been the most intense, particularly in Maguindanao province, in rural towns and villages where the group has its strongholds. And then further south still in South Cotabato and also in Sarangani province is the home of Ansar Khalifa Philippines. They've always been one of the smallest groups. Like I said, they only played a minimal role really in the Marawi siege. And for most of the past year, they have been very inactive. There's been very few instances of violence coming from Ansar Khalifa Philippines. However, in the last few months, there has been an uptick in activity. They launched a bomb attack in September in General Santos City in South Cotabato province, targeting civilians, which was really quite unusual when it emerged that it was Ansar Khalifa Philippines who had carried out this attack because they had been so inactive for most of the past year. Since then, they've been engaged in a few shootouts with the security forces. So there are signs that they may be, becoming a little bit more active. But really, the main concern at the moment in terms of the ISIS groups is the Bangsa Moro Islamic freedom fighters. They're by far the most well-resourced, kind of attractive group for jihadists in the region to join at the moment. For jihadists that are still there from Indonesia and Malaysia who managed to enter Mindanao in the build-up to the Marawi siege. They're now all with the Bangsa Moro Islamic freedom fighters. Just to summarize on the first question, really, I would say that, ISIS is not as strong as it was in the build-up to the Marawi siege when, masses of fighters were able to come over from neighboring countries. Mindanao is obviously now under martial law, so the military has cracked down. But the ISIS groups haven't gone away, and they still pose a threat going forward. So I think, the story is not over yet in terms of ISIS in the Philippines.
Thank you, Michael. As a follow-up to that, what is the relationship with the remnants of ISIL in Iraq and Syria? And is that relationship still important?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because before the siege took place last year, a lot of this really went under the radar in terms of the Islamic State infiltrating Islamist groups in the southern Philippines. They supplied them with funding through several Malaysian and Indonesian militants who had connections between jihadist groups in Indonesia and also connections with a unit of Southeast Asian ISIS fighters in Syria. So Islamic State at the time, several years ago, was proving to be successful in terms of its aims for a while. It held large swathes of territory in Syria and Iraq, and it had the resources and the capacity through this setup to actually get funding across to groups in the Philippines. However, in the past year, as the Marawi siege has come to an end at around the same time, coalition forces in Syria and Iraq took Mosul, they took Raqqa. So the Islamic State, as a coherent organization with a centralized leadership, started to become dismantled. So, it's difficult to get exact and precise information on funding, but it's likely that in the past year, the funding has really dried up from ISIS Central, if you like. So I'd really say on that these groups are still affiliated to the Islamic State. They still support their ideology. They still retain the desire to establish a caliphate in the Philippines. However, the direct support and funding from the Islamic State is minor compared to what it was in the build-up to the siege of Marawi.
Thank you for that. One of our followers online asked us a question that is related to this and to the siege, to the Marawi crisis. Marcus, so I will report his question. While groups such as Abu Sayyaf and the BIFF are highly fragmented with sections operating almost independently, during the Marawi crisis, we saw that at least 3 major jihadist groups collaborated and cooperated. Does this indicate any significant change in the conflict, or was the joint assault on Marawi merely a short-lived alliance of convenience? What is your take on that?
Yeah, at the time it was very unexpected, the fact that these jihadist groups had actually been able to join forces and cooperate with each other to such a great extent. In the Philippine Congress over the last year, opposition figures have criticized the government for alleged intelligence failures in the build-up to the Marawi siege, which actually allowed these groups to cooperate so closely with each other. And the movement of their fighters to Lanao del Sur and Marawi, especially Abu Sayyaf, who are usually based in outlying islands. Sorry, if we could go back quickly to the first one. It was quite unprecedented, really. So in terms of whether it was kind of a one-off, I think the groups, if they were able to do it, yeah, there it is. So Abu Sayyaf are usually based in Basalan, Sulu, and Tawi Tawi, which is just to the bottom left of the map. And, you know, several hundred Abu Sayyaf fighters, part of Isnilon Hapalan's faction, were able to actually move over onto mainland Mindanao, where they very rarely operate. You know, so they were able to join up with the Maute group there. And the groups, I think, if they were able to, they would look to launch another attack. They would look to cooperate with each other in such a way again. However, because martial law is in place, because the intelligence has been improved, because also the Philippines, along with Indonesia and Malaysia, are now holding regular naval patrols in the Sulu Sea area, which is surrounding those islands where Abu Sayyaf are based. So it's preventing the movement of Abu Sayyaf onto the mainland. It's preventing the movement of fighters from Indonesia and Malaysia. So even if these groups wanted to, it's now very difficult for them to come together in such a way without being detected and without their activities being disrupted. Even though ISIS is still alive in the Philippines, I think the military has really succeeded in the fact that the groups are now geographically separated from one another. So, you know, it really is as distinct as that map shows. The Maute group operate in Lana del Norte, Lana del Sur. The BIF operate in the provinces below that, and and in the south, the Ansar Khalifa Philippines are active. So it would be very difficult for them to launch an assault on such a scale again. I mean, someone like the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, they could try it on their own. They tried to take over a small town called Datu Paglas in Maguindanao earlier this year, but on that occasion, they were ejected from the buildings they'd occupied within a couple of days. They occupied a town hall and a few other surrounding buildings. So it would, in the current climate of heightened vigilance, it would be very difficult for the ISIS groups to cooperate again to launch something similar.
Thank you. As this goes on, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front is still a force to be reckoned. A peace has begun, but how is the holding up? And how are the Duterte administration and the MILF dealing with each other?
Yeah, it's even though a lot of the attention in the media in the last couple of years has been on the Islamic State-linked groups, I mean, in the Western media especially, we wouldn't really have heard anything about the Moro Islamic Liberation Front peace process in the last couple of years. But actually, the MILF is still the largest and most powerful rebel group in the Philippines. It has between 30 to 40,000 armed members. However, the group has not fought with the government for the best part of the last decade, barring a few incidents which have occurred. So the peace process has been progressing. Most of the MILF fighters remain encamped in Western Mindanao, and they do not actively seek to attack government troops or police officers. So yeah, the peace process has been progressing. An agreement was signed under the previous administration led by President Aquino in 2014, which was called the Comprehensive Agreement on the Bangsamoro, CAB. And what that agreement did was it outlined the process for setting up a new autonomous region for the Bangsamoro Muslim minority population, which make up about 20% of the population on the whole island of Mindanao, as we saw a moment ago. And the result of that agreement was it led to continuing talks under the Duterte administration. And in July this year, the two sides actually signed a peace agreement called the Bangsamoro Organic Law, or BOL, which has put us very close now to this new Bangsamoro autonomous region being realized. It still has to be ratified in a public vote, which is due to be held in January 2019, so just a couple of months' time. However, both the government and the MILF, they're campaigning for a yes vote. So they both want to see this region established. The relations between the MILF and the government are actually they're extremely good. I mean, just this week, the chairman of the MILF, Al-Hajj Murad Ibrahim, visited the military's headquarters and was given, a ceremonial red carpet welcome, which is unheard of really for a leader of this group, which used to be a big enemy of the Philippine state, to actually be welcomed. And several months before the opposite happened, the senior military commanders visited the rebels' headquarters. So it looks like the peace deal is all going to go through. I mean, it's still going to take a few years to be finalised, and it remains to be seen how successful this new region will be. I mean, just one important thing to mention as well, there is actually already an autonomous region in place, which has been in place since 1989, called the Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. But it's really been criticised for constituting autonomy just in name only, rather than actually representing real autonomy where the Moro population is given control. I mean, the law that's been passed in July, the Bangsamoro Organic Law, is very complex law. It covers many areas. The main things it is going to really achieve is that the region is going to have a new elected parliament. It's going to have a chief minister rather than just a governor. It's going to have the power to enact its own laws. It's going to receive 75% of taxation from the central government for the provinces within it. And it's going to be able to spend that money as it wishes. The people would hope for, better infrastructure and public services. We have to wait and see. We have to hope there's not going to be corruption and things that have gone on in the past. And also greater control of natural resources, because this is a key point in terms of the drivers of the conflict. Western Mindanao is actually one of the most resource-rich areas in the Philippines. Has gold, mineral deposits, fossil fuels, inland water resources. Yet it's remained the most impoverished area in the Philippines by some distance. I think I was actually researching for the Armed Conflict Survey the other week, which is going to be published in the new year. And the poverty rate in the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao is more than 40% compared to a national average of just over 20%.
That's quite a difference.
And in Lanao del Sur province, where the Marawi siege took place, the poverty rate is above 70%. So it really doesn't match up between the resources that exist there. But that's hopefully going to change with the new region. But the implementation period is quite long. There will be a transition government if it's passed in the public vote, which I expect it will be. And it will then take several years to see how it all plays out. So it remains to be seen, but in terms of the government and the MILF, it's looking positive and it's looking like real progress is being made. Just one final point to add on this question before I talk too much on it, is the fact that it sounds good, but in practice, I think it's going to be very difficult to actually implement the deal, because 30 to 40,000 armed fighters are going to have to transition from being members of a rebel group to, finding legitimate employment opportunities, to reintegrating back into mainstream society without engaging in violence. For the leaders of the MILF, they're likely to play a key role in the new transition government. So for them, it's not going to be so difficult. They have a role already waiting for them, essentially, as the organization is going to transform into a political party. But for the actual fighters and the rebels, some of whom have been with the group for decades, it's going to be a huge change. And it's going to be particularly difficult given that the one area that is the one kind of responsibility that is not going to be passed over to the administration of the new region is for defense and security. So the Philippine government, the army, the police are still going to be in charge of defense and security matters in the new Bangsamoro Autonomous Region. And that could create conflict when the military are stationed in areas which were formerly MILF strongholds. So it remains to be seen how it's going to play out, but at the moment it's looking positive, so I think we should be positive about it.
Great, thank you very much for that. There has been a spike in IEDs, in IED attacks in the last few months. What do you believe is behind that?
Yeah, and there's been several major IED attacks in the last few months, which have taken place since the peace deal was signed in July. So it's impossible to say for certain, but it does appear as if there is a correlation there between the government and the MILF signing the Bangsamoro Organic Law and the radical ISIS-linked groups launching IED attacks targeting civilians. IEDs have long been used in Mindanao, more often on a smaller scale, like roadside IEDs to target police and military vehicles and convoys. But the attacks that took place in the last couple of months after the BOL was signed were in major population centers. They were deliberately targeting civilian areas. For example, an attack carried out by the BIFF in Isilan in Sultan Kudarat province targeted a street festival. Another blast, which was perpetrated by Ansar Khalifa Philippines in General Santos City in September, targeted a shopping street. Abu Sayyaf, even though they're slightly separate from the other groups, which I'll talk about later on, they also carried out a bomb attack at a military checkpoint in Lamitan on the island of Bazalan. And the military suspect that the reason it detonated at the checkpoint was because it was stopped there, and the actual target of the blast was a festival involving school children actually in the center of the city. So, I mean, it was quite a big incident in its own right. 11 people died, scores of people were injured in that particular explosion, which was a suicide bombing, which is quite rare for the Philippines to see a suicide bombing, also claimed by the Islamic State. However, I'll talk about it more when I talk about Abu Sayyaf later on. But again, that attack came after the peace deal was signed. So it indicates the resentment that these groups feel. And I think they feel like the MILF has betrayed its original aims when it was established in the 1970s, which was to fight for a fully independent state in Western Mindanao. The MILF has reduced those demands for autonomy, and the same with the Moro National Liberation Front, an even older group, which previously signed peace deals with the government, accepting autonomy rather than full independence. So in terms of the peace process and where the ISIS-linked groups play into that, whereas the two traditional more moderate Moro fronts are pursuing autonomy and pursuing it through negotiations, the Islamic State-linked groups still strive to see a fully independent state separate from the Philippines entirely. So yeah, the IED attacks are really a way of disrupting the peace process, and I think it's something we are going to see more of, especially as they are kind of squeezed on the battlefield under martial law. IED attacks are a way of making their presence felt when they're not able to anymore engage in huge gun battles, or where they're not able to take over a city anymore like they were able to last year. So IED attacks are becoming an emerging feature of the conflict.
Thank you. That's very interesting how you link the technology of the violence to the political process. We actually had a question from an online follower about the suicide bombings that you were mentioning in your answer. So this year in July, the Philippines experienced what might have been the country's first international suicide bombing, probably conducted by a Moroccan national, according to the defense secretary. Why do you think Filipino jihadist groups do not conduct normally suicide missions? Does culture play a role in these choices at all? Or is this maybe an indicator of a superficial level of indoctrination? What is your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly an unusual event, and it took everybody by surprise, considering that since the Marawi siege in general, the Abu Sayyaf group, which was linked to this bombing, had been more inactive than it had been in previous years. And yet, originally the military actually denied that it was carried out by a Moroccan national. They said, no, it's local members of Abu Sayyaf, because they don't really want the bad publicity in terms of the fact that ISIS have claimed a major suicide bombing when they're trying to crack down on those kind of groups. So the reason for it being a suicide bombing, I mean, in recent years with the infiltration of Islamic State and the movement of fighters from Indonesia and Malaysia through to the southern Philippines, they have brought with them a more radical brand of Islam, more often associated with jihadist groups in the Middle East, such as Al-Qaeda before, and then Islamic State in more recent times. And a lot of people who were involved in setting up some of the more radical groups, for example, the Maute group, studied in the Middle East previously. And I mean, there have been connections going back years, even with the older two Moro fronts, which are now more moderate. But I think a suicide bombing is still very unexpected, but it's something which has come along with the emergence of ISIS in terms of being a real trademark tactic of groups which affiliate themselves with the Islamic State. I mean, the fact that it was carried out by a Moroccan national is also unusual. I mean, Abu Sayyaf is primarily composed of Filipinos rather than foreign fighters. However, the attack was really a worrying indicator that perhaps there are also foreign fighters with Abu Sayyaf, albeit in small numbers, who are able to obviously come to the southern Philippines and join up with the group despite the military's the military's attempts to stop that from happening. I mean, there was also in the early part of this year, I think in January, there was a Spanish citizen and also an Egyptian citizen arrested in the islands where Abu Sayyaf have their strongholds, were charged with being members of Abu Sayyaf. So it shows that there are some foreign fighters there, and it shows that the ideology of the Islamic State, even though it's not able to support the groups financially to the extent it was before, it shows that these groups still have their ambitions to act in the same way as Islamic State, to act in the name of the Islamic State and carry out these kind of attacks. But yeah, I think in the past, the kind of Islam that we saw in the southern Philippines traditionally, and the same with Indonesia traditionally going back decades, has been more moderate than the kind of Islam we see in countries such as Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, and the kind of regions where groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS first surfaced. However, I mean, another important factor really is the nature of the global media now. I mean, people can spread their messages in such different ways to what was, how it was able to happen several decades ago or even 10 years ago. So through using social media sites, encrypted messaging apps such as Telegram is always one which is put out there as being a place where these groups are able to communicate with each other unobserved. It increases the flow of radical ideas to regions which historically have Muslim populations, but in the past were not so radical in nature. So the media and the internet technology plays a role in the dissemination of these ideas as well. So all of this has led to eventually a suicide attack in the Philippines, something that traditionally wouldn't be associated with that. And it is also interesting, it was carried out by a foreign national because, as he said in the question, as the person who put the question said, it's not something which is traditionally done by Filipinos. The exact reasons for that, it's not possible to give an exact answer as such.
Especially with such a small sample, it's difficult to analyze. But yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for pointing us to some of the dynamics we should be looking at. Since you have given such a good and complete pictures of all the groups involved, maybe you want to spend a couple of words elaborating a bit more on the Abu Sayyaf group and how it fits now in the conflict.
Yeah, definitely. I've actually researched Abu Sayyaf for more than 2 years, so longer than I've been researching all the other conflicts on the Armed Conflict database for about 1.5 years. So I feel I know the Abu Sayyaf group in a lot more detail, if you know.
It's more personal.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't describe it as, but Abu Sayyaf is slightly different from the other groups in terms of the way it operates.
Yeah.
Not only in terms of its areas of operation on those outlying islands, Basilan, Sulut, and Tawi-Tawi. It also operates, by the way, you can just about see the green shading around the Zamboanga Peninsula on Mindanao and around the coast of Sabah in Malaysia in the bottom left-hand corner. The group sometimes carries out piracy attacks and maritime kidnappings along those coastlines, as well as around its main island strongholds. And the other ISIS groups in the Philippines, they're not really known to carry out kidnappings in the same kind of way that Abu Sayyaf does. For example, when the Mauta group took hostages in Marawi, the hostages that didn't escape were simply killed in the manner that Islamic State would kill hostages without asking for a ransom. The Abu Sayyaf group, in contrast, are more profit-driven in terms of their ideology, rather than simply being a jihadist group, which some factions of it are affiliated to Islamic State, other factions aren't. But it's more of a criminal enterprise. The military and the government actually often describe Abu Sayyaf as bandits rather than militants or jihadists, because that is their mode of operation, and they've done that for a considerable period of time. In terms of Abu Sayyaf's involvement in the Marawi siege last year, I'd say that was more of an outlier rather than something which Abu Sayyaf is going to be doing more of or has done in the past. The majority of its activities have been to enrich itself, to solidify its position in those islands where it's based. to sustain itself, to pay its fighters and family members of fighters and clans which they belong to. I mean, all of these groups in the Philippines are really clan-based, and there's a lot of blood ties, if you see what I mean, in terms of the membership of these groups. And in some cases, there's cross-membership. But in particular, this is the case with Abu Sayyaf, that it's a very clan-based group, shall we say. And it does operate to a large extent as a criminal enterprise. As well as kidnappings, it's also launched piracy attacks in the past, which did kind of make the news everywhere. A few years ago, in 2016, there was a spate of piracy attacks on quite large vessels, and the media was comparing these waters in the southern Philippines to Somalia at the height of the piracy crisis there about 10 years ago. And while these attacks from Abu Sayyaf have dwindled in the last few years in the wake of the naval patrols, in the last few months, particularly since the Marawi siege last year, we've seen Abu Sayyaf revert again to those more criminal type activities. They haven't actually been very successful in carrying those kind of attacks out because their capabilities are far lower than they were 2 or 3 years ago. The most powerful faction was led by Isnilon Hapilon, which fought in Marawi, and the whole faction was essentially wiped out. So that left the remaining factions, which are smaller, they're less well-resourced. So instead of attacks on large commercial vessels, instead of kidnapping Westerners, hoping for massive profits, they're now kidnapping locals, school teachers, the children of local businessmen, and trying to get whatever sort of ransom they can from the families. I mean, yeah, the Philippine government, obviously, as many governments do, they refuse to negotiate, they refuse to pay ransoms. But Abu Sayyaf still tries to get what it can. And it's quite brutal, obviously, if it doesn't work out. It's beheaded numerous hostages in the past. Another reason for the kind of targeting of lower value targets, if you like, is because Westerners really don't go to these islands anymore because the threat of kidnapping from Abu Sayyaf is so high. It was something which in the late 2000s and the early 2010s, it happened a lot. Several Canadian workers were killed. Abu Sayyaf abducted people of several nationalities, and many of them were beheaded when the ransoms it demanded, which often ran into tens of millions of pounds. If they weren't paid, they were beheaded once the deadline passed, and that was it. But Abu Sayyaf is not really able to do that anymore because those people simply aren't there for them to kidnap. So yeah, I'd say the difference between Abu Sayyaf and the other groups is that it's more criminally oriented, it's more clan-based, and it is not so beholden to its ideology in terms of religion and in terms of the Islamic State, even though that was, its original founding ideology. It's more interested in sustaining itself as an armed group, and its ideology is always in a state of flux, really, whereas these other groups are much more closely aligned with the goals of the Islamic State.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll give you a minute break and I'll turn to Tim for a question. Tim, it would be great if you could help us put everything Michael has said in a regional context. So what are the key trends and dynamics we should be paying attention to understand the international significance of the violence in the Philippines?
Thank you. First of all, I must say that I think Michael's assessment of recent activities of the various armed groups in the southern Philippines is highly accurate and comprehensive. I think maybe the significance of Marawi could be overstressed. These various extremist groups, Maute and others, they got lucky with Marawi. And perhaps this in a way was the Philippines 9/11. It was a unique and horrific and traumatic event, but there was a very strong response to it. And although there's been talk about a continuing threat to other major settlements and cities in the southern Philippines and the possibility of a repeat and so on, I take that with a pinch of salt, honestly. I really don't see that happening.
To add to that, I think these groups such as Sayyaf, they can often lay low for a period of time, if they know that the military are onto them. So I think during the time when the US forces were present in Basilan, I think there's actually 600 US personnel, which is double the number the Philippine military thought were in Abu Sayyaf.
Yeah.
So in theory, they should be massively outmatched. But
Exactly.
these Abu Sayyaf, the fighters, blend into the communities.
Yeah.
Many of them are actually only teenagers,
Yes.
so it's very difficult to identify them.
Yeah, I mean, I think you made another very good point about clan affiliations of the various groups, and also, of course, clan rivalries and even clan warfare, which partly explains why these groups sometimes fight each other, and also criminality, that they may masquerade as nationalist or Islamic or Islamist groups, but actually sometimes it's hard to see whether they're really ideologically motivated or if they're motivated by criminality. Often both. So it's all extraordinarily complex. And I think what's worried other governments in the region in recent years is that it seems to fit into a pattern of a growing terrorist threat, which has also been apparent in Indonesia and Malaysia, and to some extent in the southern Philippines. But in each national case, there are quite precise local, regional, and national explanations for what's going on. So sometimes when outsiders look at what's happening in Southeast Asia, they see, Islamic State is gaining ground, there's a really serious threat, returning fighters, and also a whole range of challenges. But actually, I think this has hugely exaggerated the problem. Actually, in concrete terms, the overall terrorist threat in Southeast Asia has been well contained, particularly in Indonesia, where the security forces have shown that actually they're and the intelligence service since the Bali bombing in 2002, they've shown actually they're pretty effective, and they've arrested and as well as have eliminated a large number of terrorists. They've brought many to trial. They've executed a number after proper legal process. In Malaysia, the local threat has been relatively small. I think the threat posed in Malaysia has been more by Malaysians joining groups in the southern Philippines and in Indonesia, rather than perpetrating acts of violence on Malaysian soil. So my overall conclusion is that the problems in the southern Philippines are extremely complex. They're related to injustice and criminality and history. But as Michael said, ultimately it's this peace process in the southern Philippines which is really vital, and that there needs to be a comprehensive settlement and accommodation of actually quite legitimate wishes on the part of the Moro people in the southern Philippines. And if their legitimate grievances are settled through this political process which is underway, that should help to undermine the appeal of extremism and the capacity of groups linked to the Islamic State or whatever is the current major threat internationally, and should be able to reduce the violence in the long term.
Thank you, Tim.
Should I just add one or two things to that? I think it's an extremely important point, actually, in terms of taking away the drivers of recruitment for the groups which affiliate themselves with the Islamic State. Because as Tim said just there, Islamic State has really come into this conflict as an intruder, if you like. They've almost hijacked aspects of an insurgency, which for the last 5 decades, since the 1970s, and even going back hundreds of years before that against colonial powers, has been really rooted in local grievances and political grievances often, rather than being driven by some overarching ideology. This is really, like I said, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front has 30 to 40,000 armed fighters still. The Moro National Liberation Front has around 10,000. So the actual numbers in these ISIS-linked groups are very small in comparison. And in terms of public support, there's very little public support for Islamic State generally. The vast majority of people in this region actually back the older, more moderate rebel groups. And they're supportive of the peace process, which I think we'll see in the plebiscite, the public vote, which is due in January next year. Just one extra point on the actual root causes and what started off this conflict, the underlying drivers, which you mentioned at the start there, in terms of previous colonial powers in the region. The Muslim population in Western Mindanao has actually been there since the 1300s. With the arrival of Arab traders in the Sulu Islands. So they have been there for hundreds of years, far predating the Philippine state. And before the Moro insurgency started in its current form in the 1970s, Moro insurgents fought uprisings against, as you said, US, Spanish, and Japanese colonialists during World War II. In the early 1900s, there were essentially massacres committed by US colonial troops in the islands which have now become home to Abu Sayyaf. So you can see how the conflict started off. And I think it's important to say that the ISIS-linked groups have really tried to hijack the insurgency.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, but I also wanted to give the opportunity to the audience here to ask questions. Maybe I'll ask one more and then I'll pass it on to you. And this is a question to both of you. Can you tell us about the political and humanitarian impact of the conflict at present? What are the main issues that are at stake, in your opinion? Michael, you want to start maybe?
I can do, yeah. In terms of the humanitarian impacts, compared to other conflicts around the world, the humanitarian impact of the violence from the Islamic State-linked groups here has not been huge compared to what we've seen in places like Syria, Iraq, the ongoing humanitarian impacts from conflicts in Afghanistan, Yemen, and elsewhere. The communities most affected are those in rural areas where the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters operate. And also in the Philippines, there's obviously a communist insurgency being waged by the New People's Army, which also affects civilians in rural areas. So it's in these pockets of territory where the humanitarian situation is impacted. In the rest of the Philippines, where the conflict is not going on, there's very little feeling of any conflict going on at all. Displacement this year has been occasionally in the tens of thousands in single periods of violence lasting a few days. We haven't seen population movements in the hundreds of thousands this year. Most of those displaced are able to return home once violence subsides. However, they're still left to live in fear of repeat displacement and the fear of having armed groups present in their communities. So particularly some indigenous groups, such as the Tejure tribe, are impacted by these ISIS-linked groups, such as the BIFF. Their communities are in very close proximity to their areas of operation. I know in late 2017, the militants burnt down several villages for no apparent reason, really, just sort of ransacked the villages and burnt down the houses of this particular tribal group. So they're very directly impacted by the conflict. In terms of people in major cities, outside of the Marawi siege and the IED attacks that we've seen, there's been no impact there. I think 69,000 people, it was said a few months ago, are still displaced from Marawi. More than 250,000 have been able to return. The central area of the city, the Bangolo district, was completely devastated. So it will be several years before those residents are able to return. So there's an ongoing humanitarian impact there. which is being added to in little bits here and there, but there's been nothing of that scale since. In terms of the political impacts related to the peace process is really where that comes in the wider politics of the Philippines. I'm not 100% sure, as I mostly research the conflict dynamics. However, I know opposition politicians often raise in discussions the rising number of IED attacks, and there's been criticism of Duterte's decision to extend martial law across Mindanao by opposition parties and by human rights groups. Martial law is actually due to expire on the 31st of December this year. However, President Duterte has asked the armed forces and also the Philippine National Police on their opinion on whether it should be extended, and so far the indications are that they do want to see martial law extended into next year. So I think there will be an announcement on that relatively soon, and we will probably see martial law extended. It basically enables the military and police to set up road checkpoints with greater frequency, which does play a role, I think, in preventing things such as IED attacks, because there's been plenty of examples where there's been shootouts with vehicles at checkpoints which have been found to be carrying explosive devices. So there is an argument for martial law. Opponents say it's an excuse for a wider human rights crackdown on leftist groups linked to the communist movement and other opponents of Duterte. So that's what I'll add there, really.
Thank you very much.
I have nothing to add to that.
Thank you. Then I'll turn to the audience, please. And are there any questions? Please, Nick.
Okay. Firstly, thank you very much for the detail you provided so far. Michael, you mentioned that in the wake of the siege of Marawi, there's in general been an atmosphere of heightened vigilance. Has there been a change in the security response in the region since Marawi? Have the forces deployed in the area changed? How have they improved their competence? And a second question relates to the MILF and the peace agreement. As you mentioned, there are tens of thousands of MILF fighters. Are there demobilization, disarmament, reintegration plans for those fighters? Are there intentions of integrating any of those fighters into the Philippine security forces?
Thank you. Any other questions in the audience? Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. Michael, I just wanted to pick up your point, and Tim, actually, you may be able to add to this as well. You said at the beginning that during the siege of Marawi, the Mauti group went from about 1,000 fighters down to 50. That strikes me as a very, very high rate of attrition, and I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the fighting tactics of the Philippines armed forces, how restrained you'd say they were, or maybe not restrained, but how carefully you think they distinguished between fighters and between civilians, and whether or not that's had an impact on local grievances, etc. How do you think that the ordinary citizens of Mindanao feel about the Filipino military?
Okay, I'll probably tackle those in reverse order. So with that one on the decline in the Mauti group numbers, obviously when the Philippine security forces first went into Marawi in their attempt to capture Islamist and Moro, they expected there to be just a very small number of fighters in the city. In the end, the figures they released suggested that more than 1,000 were killed. There is some dispute between whether that figure was exaggerated by the Philippine military to try and make their campaign look like it was a resounding success as the siege wore on and the public became more and more frustrated. I mean, it's for sure that a lot of Mauti group fighters were killed in Marawi. The group was almost completely decimated. Whether there were 1,000 or 700 or 800 is a matter for debate, really. The official figures say there was more than 1,000 militants killed. And in terms of the tactics deployed in Marawi by the Philippine military, it was a different style of fighting to what they are used to. Most of the insurgencies in the Philippines occur in rural areas, in jungle environments. Obviously, this siege happened in a built-up urban area. So it's a major reason why the siege went on for so long, because the Philippine military did not have so much experience in urban combat. They've received, which actually adds into one of Nick's questions in terms of the measures put in place since then. Australia has been training Philippine troops in urban combat. The US has been providing reconnaissance support and training through things like drones. So they're trying to improve those skills in case something else were to happen again, although it's very likely, as Tim mentioned earlier, it would be on a far smaller scale. It's very unlikely that something as big as the Marawi siege is going to reoccur. So as well as the combat on the ground, the Philippine military conducted a huge aerial bombing campaign for the entire 5 months of the siege. They did attempt to avoid hitting civilians, as the Maute group were holding several hundred hostages, most of whom were in mosques. And Duterte actually did kind of flirt with the idea halfway through the conflict of targeting mosques and just obliterating all of the Maute group fighters as quickly as possible. In the end, it was decided that was not the best way to go about things, which I think was probably the right decision, given that there were hundreds of hostages down there and given that these buildings have huge, religious and cultural significance for the Moro population. That would have been a terrible thing to do in terms of angering people who were previously not so opposed to the government. So, it was definitely the right decision. But it meant the siege went on a long time. In the final days of the siege, there were huge gun battles in the buildings which the Maute group still occupied, and several hundred militants were killed in the final days and weeks of the siege. So yeah, that I think kind of answers the question number 3 there. And Nick, back to your question in terms of the change in the deployments of the Philippine military and their change in outlook since the Marawi conflict. Obviously the military have continued to be deployed heavily in Western Mindanao. They've sent additional battalions as well to Sulu. I think there are 11 battalions on the island of Sulu now, and each battalion has 500 fighters. So between 5,000 and 6,000 government troops are based on Sulu, which is a huge number given that Abu Sayyaf only has 300 fighters. So they really want to prevent that group from re-emerging. And they do launch large-scale operations against Abu Sayyaf all the time. There was in fact one, I think on Monday this week, where they were going to try and locate the hostages still being held by the group, and Abu Sayyaf actually launched an ambush and were able to kill 5 government troops. So they're still taking the fight. The military is still taking the fight to all of the Islamic State groups. In terms of the general way they're putting themselves across to ensure the public are on side, which the vast majority of them are, they're on the side. The public, on the whole, are on the side of the military when they're going after these radical elements. There's been a lot of goodwill, if you like, between the military and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and between the government and the MILF. So at the moment, relations are good on the whole. In certain circumstances, there are accusations of human rights abuses, unjustified killings, for example, when fighters were alleged to be unarmed, but they were killed anyway by the military. Investigations have been launched. Just in one case, as a quick example, several months ago, the government, during an anti-drugs raid, government troops clashed with members of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, thought to be members of a drug syndicate. And from the military side, they said that the MILF members fired on them as they entered the building. The MILF claimed that their members were unarmed and were not involved in the drugs trade. So it threatened the peace process and it created some tensions very briefly. But there is actually a Malaysian-led monitoring team in Mindanao to monitor the ceasefire between the government and MILF. So they launched an investigation, which is still ongoing. So that kind of lessened tensions. So on the whole, relations are very good between the military and the moderate rebel groups. In terms of reintegration for MILF fighters, Duterte has actually welcomed that they apply to join the Philippine National Police and the armed forces. And I think it would make sense if the battalions of the military based in Western Mindanao could have a very large contingent of Moro Muslims serving within them. That would really help in terms of relations between the army and the local communities. In fact, I think that's really important. especially as Duterte has ruled out, any kind of separate Moro police force or military. And the MILF has pledged to fully decommission, so it's not planning to maintain any of its own armed rebel units. It's going to be phased over the next 2 years. I think they say it's going to be 30% done by January. So there is plans for integration, but it remains to be seen how successful those will be and how many former rebels will take up that opportunity.
Thank you very much, Michael. If you, in the 30 seconds that we have left, could address a question that came in today from a follower online. Where does the data come from for the analysis of this conflict, and what are the core sources and how you verify your data?
Yeah, for the armed conflict database, in terms of verification, every timeline entry, which makes up the armed conflict database, has to be verified through several different media sources, usually independent media sources rather than government-run media sources. And I would usually look for, as other ACD researchers would do as well, at least 2 independent sources to verify the information and cross-checking the details between sources. For example, and it would all be from local media organizations. So in the Philippines, you'd have like the Philippine Daily Inquirer, the Philippine Star as national level, and Manila Times, Manila Bulletin. And at the local level, there's many different publications which have online versions as well, based in Mindanao. So the information is mostly open access. It's quite readily available if you know where to look for it. And details will be cross-checked between different media reports, because obviously sometimes there can be inconsistencies. So it's verified to the highest extent possible through independent sources, which is really important to make the figures as accurate as possible. And if something is unverified, if it's rumor, if it's seems suspicious from a government-only source or a rebel source, and it's not repeated in any independent media organizations, then it wouldn't be included.
Great. Brilliant. Thank you so much for your great insights. Thank you very much, Tim and Michael, and to you for joining us today. Have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.